This video was brought to you by TLDR Business. It's no secret that travelling in the UK by train is not exactly an enjoyable experience at the moment. Strike days are making it difficult to tell if the trains are even running, and even when they are, they're often delayed, cancelled or overcrowded. Were they always like this? Do they have to be like this? And why are they like this? It's worth starting this video by establishing what makes the UK's position with trains so unique. Here in the UK, the railways are privatised, and have been since the late 90s. Now, we could spend days debating the benefits and drawbacks of the decision to privatise trains, but ultimately the main pro is that it's hugely increased passenger numbers. They've doubled in the 26 years since privatisation leading up to the pandemic, and it has increased investment. The main drawback is that ticket prices have gone up hugely. Fares have risen 48% in real terms since privatisation, and have led to a lot of confusion for passengers. When people complain about UK railways being terrible, this is likely what they're referring to. So let's have a look at how this situation came about, why it hasn't worked, and whether the recently announced system will work any better. Rail travel in the UK used to be run through British Rail, a nationalised company which was funded by the taxpayer. This was seen as a necessity even by Conservative governments who were hell-bent on privatising as much as possible, notably Margaret Thatcher. In office, she privatised everything from British Aerospace to British Telecom. Now, you might be wondering why the Iron Lady herself decided to put her own political ideology aside and leave British Rail in the hands of the public, even when she was in the midst of a privatising spree. Well, to put it simply, she realised that privatising the railways just wouldn't work for one simple reason. Private companies couldn't both make money and maintain the same level of service. The thing about British Railways is that while there are profitable routes, there are a lot of unprofitable routes too. Small Scottish towns that rely on the train network in order to be connected to the bigger cities and therefore the rest of the UK see very low passenger numbers. As a result, any operator running this route would lose money. When this is in the hands of the taxpayer, this bill can simply be footed by the public. We accept that these rail routes are essential, and although we have to pick up the bill, it's just a price we're willing to pay. If British Rail were in the hands of a private company, they likely wouldn't see things the same way. They're ultimately driven by profit, and if a route lost money, it'd simply be axed. Many communities up and down the country would lose vital rail connections, communities that would likely blame the government for privatising it in the first place. So, you may be wondering, if Thatcher decided against privatising British Rail for this very reason, does British Rail still exist, and is the nationalised model to blame for the current state of affairs? Well, not exactly. You see, while Thatcher didn't want to privatise the railways, her successor, John Major, decided that rail privatisation was something worth going for. Following a decision by the European Union, the UK government had to create a separate company to run rail tracks so that private companies could run their own rail route and compete with the government. This competition, it was reasoned, could give customers more choice and could allow the private sector to operate trains in a more efficient way. The UK government, though, decided to take this further and not only created Railtrack, who owned, well, the rail tracks, but also created the franchise system, which replaced British Rail. Now, this is where things get a little bit complicated. In essence, to try and address the problem we raised earlier, the UK's passenger rail network was split into franchises. In essence, a group of passenger rail routes. Some of these routes were profitable, and some were not. Overall though, as each franchise had both, and no one franchise had all the unprofitable routes, a rail operator had the ability to turn a profit. Each franchise would be open to the private sector to bid on, and the government would simply select the bid that lost the least and made the most money. Importantly though, rail operators would be required to run all passenger rail routes that are part of the franchise. They're not legally allowed to kill off a route simply because it's too expensive. In fact, rail operators who took on a franchise had very little they could do with it at all. The contracts were tight, leaving very little room for operators to exercise their own autonomy. What ended up happening is that the government would accept whichever potential operator overpromised the most, promising to deliver the most at the least cost. Ultimately, this led to many operators simply not being able to achieve what they promised, leading many rail operators to fail, a new franchisee to be selected, and then for the new franchisee to fail again, and so on and so on. This system got even worse when the pandemic hit, because rail operators had to continue providing a rail service with hugely reduced passenger numbers. This led to the government introducing emergency recovery contracts, which essentially saw the government reassume responsibility, including finance of the railways. In essence, it was a temporary renationalisation. Now, this isn't too strange. In times of crisis, the government tends to renationalise stuff to stop it collapsing. This is exactly what Gordon Brown did with the banks in the wake of the 2008 financial crash. This was the beginning of the end for the UK's privatised rail network, though, as later on in 2021, Transport Minister Grant Shapps announced a new plan for the railway. The franchising system will end, and a new company, Great British Railways, it does sound familiar, doesn't it, will be created. It will set fare prices and rail timetables, and work with private companies to actually operate the trains. In essence, it's a system a lot closer to nationalisation of the railways. Rail companies will no longer take fares. Any small amount of control they had about rail timetables will be taken from them. The government will decide on which rail operator to go with by awarding the contracts to operators which run high-quality services and increase passenger demand. This is the system that Transport for London uses with the London Overground. Now, it's hard to tell whether this system will work. As the FT points out, though, the government wants to both increase spending while finding savings of more than £1 billion. In fact, transport expert Christian Wolmar has gone as far as saying that there is supposed to be more saving, more spending, and it's magic money tree stuff, isn't it? Ultimately, it's not known whether this new system will work, but the hope is that it will address the downfalls of the privatised system. Anyway, if this kind of battle interests you, the intersection of politics and business, then you ought to check out the newest channel, TLDR Business. There, we've analysed which streaming service won 2022, discussed Elon Musk's drama at Twitter, and if he's compromised by China. We've broken down why Apple has too much money, explained why everyone, especially Taylor Swift, hates Ticketmaster, questioned if TikTok is the ultimate Chinese propaganda tool, and explained why Twitter had to scrap their clone of OnlyFans. All of these videos and much more can be found on TLDR Business, which you really ought to subscribe to right now. And make sure you subscribe to TLDR News UK while you're at it to get more videos about UK politics.